What I'd quite like to know, though, Wade, is where did your interest in metacognition come from? Then I'll tell you where my interest came from.
Fair enough. So for me, I've always been intrigued with learning, and not just in the just a matter of receiving information, but also how the brain works. So I end up doing a lot of research over time in regards to everything from speed reading to memory exercises, how to enhance, how we think. And then I stumbled upon a few years back a guy by the name of Joe Dispenza. And Joe had a book called Supernatural, basically having the connective tissue between mind and body. And that took me down another relevant rabbit hole into metacognition, thinking about what you think about. And I was intrigued and very fascinated to know that it's an actual science to understand thinking about what you think about, how thoughts create choices, choices create behavior, behavior create experiences, creating new thoughts. Because that was my other question is, where do thoughts come from? It sounds like a rudimentary question, but really, where does it come from? And it's the chicken and egg analogy. What comes first? So with
Yeah.
that being said, I started to research things like the Einstellung, as far as getting stuck is where you were, and things of that nature. And then from there, I've always been in technology and innovation. So I wanted to see what the connection was between innovation and thought process. Did Bill Gates really stumble upon,
Mm.
Microsoft? Did Steve Jobs, Michael Dell? You can go on. How did that happen? Was it a need or was it an aha moment? And if it was, what did the aha, can you reproduce an aha moment? Can you bottle an aha moment? So that takes me right back to thinking about what you think about. So that's where the antecedents of my curiosity came.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you started with the AI and then the metacognition became attached to that the idea of AI, and I came from the other direction. So
Okay.
mine was similar to yours in that I became fascinated by the way the brain works when my daughter was born, which is now 45 years ago, so it's a long time ago. But I saw the way that she was interacting with the world around her as a very small child and wondered what was going on inside here. She seemed to be kind of um, making an understanding of everything very quickly. And I thought, how is that happening? And it was because of that interest that I then did a lot of personal research as well into how the brain works, how it learns. And it was actually that led me to doing a science degree later on when she was much older,
Yeah.
because I was still interested in that. And the degree that I did included psychology, which was my favorite part of it, obviously. And then I took my teacher training after that, and I was very disappointed when I got into school and found that all that research I'd done and all that psychology that backs up the way the brain learns wasn't being used in schools to teach children. And I thought, I cannot believe I'm being expected to teach in the old traditional Victorian ways
Mhm.
when we know so much is different to the way that the brain works. So I was quite upset by that, but I was given the opportunity to do some training with a neuroscientist while I was teaching, which I grabbed with both hands, obviously. So I picked up what was then known as brain-friendly learning.
Yeah.
So they've moved away from that term now, but that was the term that was being used at the time, um, and was actually paid to pilot some of that way of teaching and learning in my classroom, which
Right.
was great. But I'm going to cut a very long story short because I went on to do other advisory roles in education, and ended up working for a team who were supporting looked after children or children in foster care who had behavioural difficulties as a result of their previous traumas. And it's I still found that it was what's going on inside the head. How are these children learning? How are their experiences affecting the way they learn and how they're able to learn? And so I kind of pulled together a huge amount of, well, a couple of decades worth of knowledge about all of that and took it into schools to try and help turn around the learners who were struggling. and had a lot of success with that as an independent success coach. And it was then that the word metacognition started coming up. I hadn't used it anywhere because on the rare occasions where it came up, nobody knew what it meant. So,
Right.
but it because it was then becoming a word in schools,
Mhm.
um, teachers were saying to me when we were talking about the progress that these students were making, and everyone was going, how are you doing this? How are these students making the progress that we couldn't help them with? And the teachers kept coming up with the word metacognition. So I thought, finally, I can start using that word and people will know what I'm talking about. And what it then became the focus of the work I was doing, that helping learners to change the way that they were learning so that they could learn more effectively and make more progress. And that it was that turnaround that was making the difference for those students. So that was kind of how metacognition became the big word in my life. Coming at it from that educational perspective and gradually honing it down to what I think is one of the biggest keys for learning.
Absolutely. So as you were working with students, you made the connection. What was a one of the aha moments for you as you were working with students, from a behavioral perspective or just from a cognitive learning perspective? Was there any aha moment that yes, this is the path to take
Do you mean an aha moment for me or for the students?
for you?
Um, I think it was recognizing that what I was doing with the students was working with all of them, whatever their difficulty. So it wasn't doing something different with each child. I was doing exactly the same thing with each student, and it worked every time for every student. And that was what made me realize that putting them in charge of their own learning, giving them the knowledge and the ability to use their own mind to make their own progress and take their own responsibility for all of that, that was palpable to see each of them doing that gradually. And that was when I realized that that was what was needed, was giving them the skills they need to be in charge of their own learning.
Understood. Understood. Okay, very good. Now, um, as they begin to understand the connection, because that's the big thing in regards to thinking about what you think about. We all do it all the time. We don't recognize that, 90% of self-talk, well, 80% is not positive, and most of it is about the past. We don't make those connections, but when we do, we move forward. Was there a time when they started to have the students have an aha moment as far as connecting metacognition to their learning experience?
I never actually used the word metacognition with the students. They were not aware of that.
Okay.
Um, it was for all of them, it was that moment where they realized that they were in charge, as it were. And it's different from each child from that point of view. When I either trained teachers or when I was working with the students, for me, there are three things that need to be in place before anybody can think in a metacognitive way. And the first one is that the child has to believe that they can do it or that they have the right to do it. Because some students, the homes they come from, it's like school isn't for them. Learning is for clever people or whatever. So they either have to believe that they are capable of learning and that they have the right to learn. Secondly, that they have to understand how learning happens because metacognition is about changing your mind about how you're doing things. So if they don't understand the learning process, then they can't make the changes.
Right.
And thirdly, the one thing that school tends to drum into them is the passive nature of learning. They're supposed to sit still and be quiet, listen to the teacher, do as I say, which is all very passive. Whereas in fact, real learning involves the active involvement. Each student's own mind has to be actively switched on to the learning in order to make it work. So that's what I found with each of those three things. As we worked our way through, I would start with the self-concept, then the learning process, then the need to take charge of your own learning. And so that's when the switching on comes. And I saw the difference. I'll give you one example. There was a girl who was totally switched off. The school were really worried about her because she wasn't making any progress and she didn't really seem like she was all there. She lived, they said she lives in her own little bubble. She doesn't seem to be present half the time. Um, and I worked with her for a while, and then suddenly something clicked for her. And the next session we had, she came rushing to me and she said, "Look what I've done, look what I've got." And she'd got folders and files that were all labeled and notebooks and things. She'd suddenly realized that she was responsible, that she didn't have to just sit and listen to everybody talking at her and hope that it all sank in. She had something she could do, and she set herself up for it. And but so it was like that switch that you said, and they all have that moment where they switch on,
Right.
depending on where they're stuck in that kind of sequence, if you like. But they get to the point fairly quickly that they, without using the word metacognition, where they realize that they have the ability to learn. Sometimes that is proving that to them. Sometimes is what I've had to do is prove that they can do it. Um, a big one is understanding the learning process, which I teach them, and then they recognize their own responsibility, and then they're away.
Very good. Very good. Okay, that's great. As we talk about students, we talk about metacognition, and you're right, to a point where most people from a pedestrian nature aren't familiar with the word, the term. While we do it, we don't understand that part. We get that. Um, Also, there's that learning point, and I like you got to believe it, understand the impact, and then what I'm hearing you say, the passive, or basically you have to be kinesthetic about it, be involved in the process.
You have to
So
take
that's
responsibility, yeah.
absolutely. So with that
Yeah.
being said, I relate that because from a student, I relate that to business owners that I work with, and in regards to problem solving. Most of
Yeah.
the time when it comes to being first, best, different, faster, cheaper, better, you want to be able to save time, save money. You want to create this product where people are buying it, right? Or service where people are buying it. You're doing something for commerce. But in order to do that, there's this competitive advantage that everybody's looking for, and this is where I play. So as I'm talking to and working with business owners, whether it's inside of a corporation or a sole proprietor company who has their own company, one of the things that I recognize is they do recognize they have a product and a service for a price. That's table stakes.
Mm.
But then from there, and I'm getting to where this metacognition AI comes from. From there, it's like, but why me? Why should someone do business with me versus my competition?
Mhm.
And that's where it gets sticky because you can be so in love with your product that you forget about, well, what does the customer need? What does the human need? What are the audiences at large? What are they really looking for?
Mhm.
And sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. So from there, one of the things that I'm trying to do, always helping to do, is think about what you're trying to do. Think about your product, think about your service, think about your customer. And that whole process of thinking it seems like okay, but it's a point because to your point, in school we were never taught to think. We learned
No.
to read, write, taking information passively, but there was no, learning session on the mind. If it was,
Mhm.
man, we'll be so far on. So
Mhm.
it's not too late because we're always students, right? So with
Yeah.
that being said, from what you're talking about as far as believing as adults, because you're talking about it from a children, adolescents perspective, adults,
Mhm.
we do have a belief. There are limiting beliefs that we have that hold us back, but
Yeah.
that belief has to continue to be purported, right? So I appreciate that point. And then the other thing is, to your point, that fundamental shift from this is how I used to do it to
Mhm.
this is how I need to do it in order to
Mhm.
move forward. So that fundamental shift needs to take place, whether it's consciously or not. And that's where that take responsibility. So that's why I say I appreciate those points because that's the
Yeah.
other point. There's a fundamental shift in human society right now because of technology. It's almost like we're chasing technology because it's like, we've gone from, I always talk about, going from, candles to electricity, the horse and buggy to cars, and
Yeah.
pre-internet, fax machines to now, here we are talking with Zoom, and we're talking without any full production. There's no cameras around outside our little ones on our laptop.
Yeah.
So the shift is, how do we use technology today? So with that being said, I'm going to ask another question, Liz. In regards to having or thinking about, and I'm going back to metacognition and AI because this is the crux of our conversation. Um, what would you say a business owner or just the person that wants to get better, what advice would you give them in regards to the thought process? What are some of the things you want to maybe have them, if you were them, these are the things that they would work on, or to be more in tune with the brain, the mind, the thought process?
Mm. Yeah, I have a whole 2 hour webinar on this.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
frantically trying to remember now
Yeah.
what's in the webinar. Um, yeah, I think one of the things that helps is if we realize that metacognition is part of the decision making processes of the brain. So it all happens here in
Hmm.
the prefrontal cortex.
Hmm.
Um, and it's what enables us to make decisions that are in our own best interests,
Hmm.
rather than making snap decisions that we're not sure what they're based on. So metacognition is all about being able to change the way that you're thinking. It's firstly about realizing that your thoughts are your thoughts. Wherever they came from, whoever put them there, they're your thoughts inside your head, and therefore you have to take responsibility for them. Because that's something that some people do, is still blame other people for things.
Sure.
So it's about taking full responsibility for what is inside your head.
Hmm.
It's then about making the decision that things are not going the way that you want. So becoming conscious of the fact that things are not panning out the way that you originally wanted them to. Again, taking responsibility for that, not blaming anybody else, and then becoming more conscious about the decisions that you make from there. That's the big difference for me. Obviously, from an educational point of view, before they start school, children are learning in an unconscious way. And then when they get into school, they have to suddenly become conscious because they're learning from a curriculum rather than from their own curiosity. It's
Right.
a very big shift that they have to make. So it's always about the how much you are consciously making the choices that you're making, and that you're basing that on something. So, like you mentioned the words, I used to do it this way and now I do it that way. And there's a reason for that shift. There's some new piece of information, new piece of understanding that has changed your perspective, which is what learning is. Learning is new things coming in and changing your previous perspective on something.
Right.
Um, and then that leads you to take the information that you have in front of you and make some new choices, new decisions about it. And it's a continuous progress, as a progress and process, in that what you've chosen to do now, you might get more information come in, feedback, if you like, from what happens when you do it that way.
Right.
You think, oh, okay, that's still not quite working. So you make another shift. But it is very much about that conscious thought and that willingness to change your mind, because some people get a bit stubborn over that. They get a fixed idea, and they won't change it. But metacognition is very much about being willing to make those changes to keep making the progress. And in my mind, you can't make progress in anything without that ability to use metacognition in order to get there.
I like that. That's so true. And I think about it's neuroplasticity.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what's happening. As we learn new things, the brain actually is changing,
Mhm.
because of the new information. And it's beyond nature nurture. It's like, oh, my mom and dad, my family, this is how we are. It's so, but it's as we began to gain new information, new experiences, our brain does change.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally true and scientifically proven. So yeah, so that's another vocabulary in regards to metacognition, it leads to neuroplasticity or the changing of the brain. And once the brain changes, you know, it doesn't really go back. It doesn't,
No,
because
that's right.
you can't unknow. We can't unknow I'm here in the United States. We can't unknow 9/11. I mean, it
Yeah,
happened and it was, man, how catastrophic.
yeah.
And we just have a million of those experiences in our life. So,
Mm,
from a positive perspective, as we learn new things, as we experience new things, especially when it comes to the space of AI, because as I work with companies, as I talk to people and audiences, the one thing that I purport and as I'm looking in the eyes of people in regards to this new technology is like the big thing is it going to take my job? That's the big thing.
yeah,
Is it
yeah.
going to take my job? And it can. But my point is this. But if we take the time to take responsibility and learn whatever the new tool is, apply it to your craft, apply it to your job, apply it to your business, everybody is better off than worse off. So that
Mm,
taking responsibility is key. You don't need money or permission to take responsibility. We just do.
mm,
But the underbelly to me, Liz, in regards to this process of metacognition and neuroplasticity of the changing, is grit to me. The
mm,
ability to be resilient enough to make the change.
mm,
That's what I'm finding. Because that back to believing and take responsibility, it's like, I don't think I can. But we
mm,
can. We totally
mm.
have, responsibility, like the take responsibility, like the kid you're talking about, that aha moment of, hey, I had that.
Yeah.
Um,
And once
okay.
they know how, once they know how, it becomes much easier. I think it's that kind of lack of ability to move forward is sometimes just not knowing quite how to engage your own brain in those internal conversations that you need to have in order to move forward. The responsibility doesn't become such a heavy burden, if you like, when your mind is already moving in that direction and you know where you're going. You don't feel the burden of the responsibility. You just take that responsibility and you move with it.
Sure.
So understanding how is quite a big thing. Although I was just wondering with your, I think we've talked a bit about it before, is there where you see the link between AI and metacognition?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, good question there. And the link is huge. And because AI, artificial intelligence, mimics human thinking. So everything about AI, artificial intelligence, when it was, conceived back in the 1950s, and has gained a lot of groundswell now, but it was all about the mimicking of how we process information. It just getting into what it is, here's the link. Everything as far as AI, it starts with data information, all the information that has been collected over the years. Our data, our information is our human experience, which is knowledge that we gained formerly, experiences that we have by living, and then connecting, when you connect thinking with emotion, that's experience that is stored not just in our brain, but also in our bodies, the connective tissue, our fascia, because
Mm,
it's now it's known that where is emotion carried? We think it's it's all what we think about. No, emotion also is carried within the body. That's why we have sweaty palms, we have a nervous stomach, or we get stiff. So all of those things are carried. So all of that's our data. So how
mm,
we carry on in life is the data in the brain and body. So with AI, the second component is modeling. Modeling is basically sets of instructions on what do you want to do with the data. Do you want to create a picture? Do you want to now surface information? Do you want to look for patterns? So all of that, those models or sets of instructions analogous to us is what do we do with the experience? We all have the experience or
mm,
experiences. What do you want to do with it? What is your self-talk like? Is it a belief that we can move forward, or is it a belief that we're stuck? Is it a belief that just because we made a mistake in the past, that's who we are, which we know it's not true, but we get stuck. You see people all the time that um, end up having chemical reactions because of the thought process, when all they have to do is, and I didn't mean to oversimplify that. Once they change or shift how they're thinking, all of a sudden they're feeling better.
Yeah.
Motion, emotion. So motion creates emotion. So it's a movement that creates something different in the body. Back to
Yeah.
AI, those instructions changes the information, not so much as to the origin of it, but how it's being used. Third piece is once AI has information, the instructions are made, and there's the output, whether it's data or a video or whatever you want it to be. The next piece is a refinement because everything that AI creates is not correct. It'll, hallucinate, things of that nature. So we look at it, we'll refine it. It's like, yeah, that's kind of it, but that's 85% right or 15% wrong. So there's this refinement taking place. So same thing with us. As we experience and try, we refine and change. And you mentioned that too. You change the approach. So, and that's another thing that we don't do enough of is recognizing I need to do this differently. So just keep
Yeah.
trying and just keep moving forward with that.
Yeah.
There is another piece once that it happens is once that refinement takes place, um, you just continue to process. And that's where people get stuck. Understanding the whole process as far as connecting AI to metacognition, you just start the process and you continue over and over again. I mean, you can say Thomas Edison or anyone who has ever been in a place of innovation. I promise you that first try was not a good try.
Yeah.
It can't be.
Yeah.
So the failure is part of the journey, and just don't give up. So that's my connection. So as I talk to audiences and work with them specifically on the application of this technology, be innovative, don't get stuck. Think about what you think about. And if it doesn't work, no problem. Just move forward to the next. So that's the
Yeah.
connection to me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I'm obviously looking at it from an educational point of view, and
Mhm.
I'm reading so many mixed messages from educators about where they see AI,
Mhm.
both personally and fitting in with
Right.
education. And they're kind of there are opposite views. I sit somewhere in the middle, so I can state both sides of the story
Right. Right.
without
Right.
being passionate for either side. But some people are saying that AI is now going to really help personalizing learning for students because a student who is maybe not making progress, that there can be a program for them that they can interact with that will help them very specifically and respond to whatever difficulty it is that they are having that will help them to move forward. And then there are those that are saying AI doesn't belong there in the sense that we need students to be able to think for themselves. And if they rely on AI for everything, then they're never going to learn to think for themselves. So there's kind of these two ends of the scale about what AI is going to mean within education. But as I say, I sit in the middle because I think, as with most things, the usefulness of it lies somewhere between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really feel, Liz, that it's not mutually exclusive.
No.
I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both. So
Yeah.
yes, let's use the tool to enhance our experience. Just like instead of walking, we ride a car. Fine. It's
Mhm.
like, well, we're not gonna walk, so we're not gonna be in shape. Heck, ride in the car and go to the gym.
And the gym, yeah. Use the
Right.
car to go to the gym, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But the other side of it too, is concentrate on teaching people how to learn, teaching students how to learn and how
Mm.
to think. And if you can, and that's obviously what you do. But if we can capsulize, hey, this is how we work, this is how we think, this is how the brain works. You move forward because all of a sudden you have an innovative person, and it's not always about creating something new, but it's also creating something better, something especially better for us. So those are the two things. You touched on something, and that was, schools of thought. There's an expression or a term, apophenia, and I know about apophenia because AI does what's called hallucinating. Well, it gets confused as far as what the truth is. So it'll start to give you information that's not true. That's why you can't always believe it. And you refine
Mhm.
and go from there. So apophenia is basically looking at patterns that are not really patterns. For example, like if we were to look at clouds and it looks like a man on horseback or Aunt Mildred or it looks like a unicorn and really we know it's not, but it looks like that. So
Looks like it. Yeah,
apophenia is basically attributing a pattern to something that's really not that, but it looks like it. So from a cloud analogy, that's fun. But the problem is when we
yeah,
start doing that from an extreme, I'm gonna give you the other dark side of it. Apophenia is something that people with schizophrenia have where they hear a hello and it's like, when you said hello, what did you mean hello? Does that mean you want to kill me later today? They started assigning a pattern to something that doesn't exist. So with
yeah.
AI, we have to refine. So with that being said, in regards to learning and attributing patterns, how can we, from your perspective, reassign a meaning to learning and a meaning to AI away from where it's a helpful experience versus something that's dark and it's gonna change us in a negative way. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you were using the word patterns there because that's how the brain works. That's what either the gift is or the
Right.
problem is, whichever way you look at it, is that the
Mhm.
brain is looking for patterns.
Right.
It's constantly looking for the familiar in the
Mhm.
unfamiliar. So,
Right.
so
Right.
that's going to be great for learning, but that also there's room for error there as well, as you say, if you're kind of seeing patterns that aren't actually there. So
Right.
it's an issue within the human brain as well. Um, I mean, I think there's room for both in the sense that I'm very concerned that we keep students able to think for themselves from a creativity point of view, that they keep their creativity, which to be honest, school doesn't encourage anyway, but I want them to be creative, and we desperately need them to be problem solvers. They're the leaders and entrepreneurs and so on of the future. So we need them to be problem solvers. Um, but I think there's also room for AI giving them the kind of support that they need to get to that point. If
Yeah.
you've got students who are stuck with their learning, as I was saying earlier on, you've got students who were very good at learning before they ever started school because they have natural cognition. If you take the meta off the front, you've got natural cognition that everybody's born with.
Right.
We're all able to learn. If you take away those that are have a serious health problem, but generally speaking,
Mhm.
every child learns with metacognition, and they have a huge database of information before they ever start school that they've picked up purely, as you've been saying, through their own experiences.
Right. The data.
And then when they get into school, they've suddenly got to change the way they think because it's not based on their own curiosity anymore. It's based on a curriculum that
Mhm.
we've decided they're going to learn, and the teacher tells them when they're going to learn it and how they're going to learn
Right.
it. And it's a very different way of learning. And it has to become much more conscious, whereas in fact the unconscious brain is actually more creative than the conscious brain is. And you've got all these students needing to learn to think consciously, but within an atmosphere that's quite stifling, really. The way that education is set up
Mhm.
stifles their creativity, stifles their curiosity, stifles their ability to think, to problem solve. But at the same time, we expect them to go through school. We
Mhm.
expect them to learn a certain amount. We have that cultural knowledge that we expect them to gain.
There you go.
Um,
Another
and
one.
we even assess them on it to make sure they've got it. So I think there's a balance between the two that I think AI could be very useful for. I mean, look, I'm looking at it from a student's perspective because that's my focus is what's going on for the student. I know AI is going to be helpful for teachers when it comes to some of their time saving
Yeah.
for doing some of the work that they would otherwise have had to do.
Sure.
Um, and I can also see its value in helping students who are struggling to get them to the point where they can then think more freely because they're not tied up with the struggle that they have. Their brain is not tied up with the difficulties that they're having. If we can get them to the point where their mind is freed up from that, from the expectation we have of what they will learn,
Right.
then they might reach that kind of more spontaneous thinking more quickly. What I recommend in the classroom is thinking out loud
Another
so
one.
that the students are all thinking out loud. They're all sharing what they're thinking. The teacher can model how to think, how to take new information and use it to change your perspective, and how to then test out that perspective and so on. So that's one way of making sure that we still have students who are thinking for themselves and are not constantly turning to a digital way. I mean, Google's wonderful. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm always Googling things, but
Right.
we live in an age where we don't need to know everything because we can Google it if we don't know. We can just check it out. We don't need to carry all that information in our heads, which should actually leave us more free for creative thinking and pursuing things that will be more meaningful down the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that your view, or do you see that differently?
No, I see it precisely like that way. I mean, to your point, you know, when Google was, first, or search engines, we'll say overall, were
Yeah,
first created,
yeah, yeah,
did we become less smart because we had a chance to search, you know?
mm,
And the answer is no, because I'm telling my age here. If we got into a library, and we got a chance to whether we're using books or microfiche, it didn't make us less smart. It was a way to research information. We just do it faster.
yeah,
But to your point, it doesn't necessarily take away our thinking ability, but we do have to work on our thinking ability.
yeah,
Um, Another thing that you mentioned is working out things out loud. And what I'm hearing is streaming consciousness in regards to we're taking in information and then we disseminate it, back to ourselves, but we hear it verbally. So there's the external sensories where we are sending it out and receiving it, and that's key. Same
mm,
thing with AI. It's the same thing. It's the ability to take in information and learn from it as it's taking it in. If you want to look at a connection there. But my point is this: to your point, yeah, it's if we look at it for the tool that it is, and we do have schools of thought that it's much more than a tool, and I have to prescribe to the fact it is more than a tool because it can reason. It's a coworker now because it can function the way we function as workers. It is a coworker. So if we put it in that box, okay, fine. Then as a coworker, how do we deal with our coworkers? How do we work with our coworkers? If you have a really smart coworker over here, I would make friends with that coworker so I can do a better job, right? So with that being said, um, taking that information in and then processing it and then using it, I think that's key. What another thing, Liz, I'm putting it back to you at this point is I think about if we're going through streaming consciousness, thinking out loud, I think about brainwaves. I think about, our alpha states, before we go to sleep at night and we wake up in the morning, we're in a place where we're receiving information more. The delta state, we're in deep sleep. But right now, we're in a beta state where we're processing. Um, do you talk much or create awareness around what brain waves are doing in the metacognition space?
Not specifically in metacognition. When I'm training teachers, I do have. Actually, I'm preparing for a conference in London at the moment, and one of my slides is about brainwaves. But it's more from the point of view of the brainwaves that are used by a newborn baby as compared to a 2-year-old, as compared to a 5-year-old, to show that when they are small and learning unconsciously, they do that because they are using much longer, slower brain waves, which is why a child sleeps so much.
Right, right, right.
But even when they're awake, before the age of 2, they're in a kind of a dreamlike state anyway, and everything is just being soaked up in a very unconscious way and stored. And then as they get older, you get other waves that kick in, but they really need to get to the age of 7, or leading between 5 and 7,
Yep.
before the shorter brainwaves kick in that enable them to reason.
Mhm.
So that you've got the you there are some schools of thought that even babies use metacognition because they will try something out, they will see whether it works or not, and then they will adjust accordingly, which
Yep.
is true. But I base my reasoning, if I can use that word, on the reason that the word metacognition was invented in the first place.
Yep.
If you take John Flavel's version of it, he's the one that's acknowledged to be the person who came up with the word.
That's right.
He was using the Greek word meta, which means going beyond or rising
That's right.
above.
Right.
So
Mhm.
it's going beyond the learning. The cognition is the learning, and the meta is going beyond the learning to think through how you're doing it. So using that definition, it means you have to be conscious. So for me, metacognition can only start at the point where you become more conscious about yourself and your own thought processes.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of going with that definition of it. And so because if we're going to change the way we think, we have to be old enough to be able to do that,
Okay.
to be able to be have that awareness of our own and be able to have that internal dialogue that you were talking about earlier on. You
Sure.
have to be able
Mhm.
to reason things out for yourself. Um, I've not looked into what's actually happening with brain waves while we are thinking, apart from the things that you'll get from imaging,
Yeah.
the medical imaging that you get where you can see which parts of the brain are lit
Mhm.
up at any one given time. And when we're reading stuff out, it's all here.
Yeah, the fMRI does that.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Uh-huh. Gotcha. Yeah, that's okay. That makes sense. And I never thought about I've always heard that, babies did have slower brain waves since they're sleeping. Yeah. But I never thought that, where does metacognition start? When do we start to teach? Because back to the student, at what age is it appropriate to teach about? Think about what you think about. Think about eating that candy. Are you gonna really want to ride that bike? But I think the earlier, the better, as far as just
Mhm.
if we're teaching reading. Let's think about, what are we reading? What does this mean? What does Mark Twain mean? W.E.B. Du Bois, what is that? What is he really saying? What is the experience? At what age is that appropriate? I think the bigger thing for me is the fact that you're just teaching them to think about, just reflect versus just going because the society we live in now is just the opposite, where, it's almost like people are encouraged not to think, just act. It's like, you only live once and experience it now. The microwave, everything is now. So there's no time for thought process versus in a sowing and gathering process or time frame where there was time to, farm until you had a chance to really think about
Yeah,
life, more reflective.
yeah,
So
yeah.
with that being said, I think there's a challenge, but it can't be overcome by just encouraging people to think about. So one thing about brainwaves, and then I know we're kind of running at time, and that is one of the things in regards to meta cognition is I want people to be in a not just in the beta state where we're doing because we need to be here, but being
Mm.
more of a gamma theta state. And gamma
Yeah,
states are, you feel good about what's happening. And we know we feel good about what's happening because we're experiencing it, right? We're in the moment, like what's his name? Tolle, Eckhart Tolle used to talk about being in the moment. And
yeah,
and then from that gamma state, being also in theta state, which is very intentional in regards to thinking. That's your
yeah,
meditative state. And that's what I try to practice. Not, and it sounds frou-frou, but really from a mental perspective, consciously thinking about and meditating on what do I want to accomplish today. Even this conversation, this morning, I had a chance to really just sit down and think about what do I want to accomplish from this. I thought about it yesterday, and then we'll go from there. Go from there. Took a couple of notes, and it's like, okay, let's have this conversation. And you're always a pleasure to talk to, so I knew it was going to organically go well. But I did take the time to consciously meditate on what I really want to take place, and then kind of move forward from there. That's the control perspective.
Yeah.
And then, we go from there. But anyway, with brain waves and AI and metacognition, the thing is, you have to be intentional in regards to your steps. I'm going
Yeah.
to pause there.
Yeah, and that was the point I was going to make about the theta waves as well, because they're the shortest and the shortest and the fastest. As you mentioned, they're the ones that we need. So that made me think, you asked about the relationship with metacognition. Presumably, when we're using metacognition, as you said, that the theta waves are going to be the ones that are going to be most, we're going to need the most
Hmm?
in order to make those reason on everything, make the changes, and be positive about changing to a new direction and seeing what happens when we get
Yeah,
when we take that new direction.
right, exactly.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah. And then that I'm not going to get into that one, but brain waves creating the chemicals in our body. While we have 1,400 different chemicals, we think about cortisol, we think about endorphins, we think about you know um, serotonin, what we have now, melatonin makes us go to sleep. But those brain waves affects our feelings, which is our chemicals. But it all starts with thought, which is back to where we are, and that is metacognition, thinking about what we think about.
Yeah.
Liz, any final thoughts for today? Because I really enjoyed this conversation. Want to be respectful of your time. Any thoughts you want to leave from this conversation? Not to say this will be the last. It won't. But any thoughts from today?
Just one thing I think that's worth mentioning, is we've already mentioned how John Flavel created the word metacognition using the Greek word meta.
Hmm.
There is a Roman word meta, right, in Latin,
Okay.
which means that something turning attention to itself, which is where the thinking about thinking comes from. So you'll get people translating metacognition literally as thinking about thinking, which
Mhm.
is not entirely wrong. We are thinking about thinking,
Right.
but I prefer John Flavel's version, which is the rising above the learning, literal translation. The
Okay.
meta is the rising above the learning, because
Mhm.
then it becomes personal. If you think about thinking, that could be a philosophical exercise where you don't actually visit what's going on inside your own brain.
Noted.
So I prefer to think of it as in the way that John Flavel meant it, which was the rising above what you're learning at this point to how you're doing it, how you're thinking, and then being able to use that for improvement. Because that was what he created the word for. He was trying to describe what students needed to be able to do in order to make progress.
Okay.
So it's very much tied up in progress. And you related it to adult life, to business, to people wanting to reach personal goals.
Mhm.
And it's all boils down to the same thing, is
Mhm.
that ability to consciously revisit your own thoughts, decide what's working and what isn't, and change your thoughts so that you can change the results that you're getting.
There you go. Beautiful. Well said. Well, listen, I really appreciate this conversation, and I got a lot out of it. And it's just like our other conversation was great. So I appreciate that. And whether it's AI or any other technology, I feel that it all starts with self and taking responsibility for what you really want to happen. Because
Mhm.
while this technology is democratized, which means anybody can have access to it, it doesn't mean that everybody is taking to it. Just like when the printing press was invented in 1400s by Johann Gutenberg, not everybody read books. I mean, you had access to all of this information. People chose not to read. So the thing is, there's this choice that we have in
Yeah.
regards to this fundamental shift that that's what I'm calling it. And this shift turns into, to your point, taking responsibility as far as what do you want to accomplish first. And once you recognize that, you have a plan from it, and then from that plan, then we use artificial intelligence to enhance that. Nothing to be afraid of, but it just starts with people. So Liz,
Mm.
thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your time, and we will talk again soon. Thank you, ma'am. I
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Wade.
Okay.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank
You
you.
too. All right.
Bye.
Okay. Bye bye.